Hello everyone, and welcome to the first of our online lectures. As I mentioned on Moodle, I'm going to be pre-recording our lectures so that we can use our class time for questions and discussion if that's something you're interested in. The goal here is to give you flexibility without losing that structure that comes from meeting in person, because I'm still going to be able to sit with you guys and we can chat on Tuesdays and Thursdays to go over any questions or things we want to meander off about. But these lectures should be pretty much the same as what you would get in class, just minus my fabulous hand gestures and probably plus a few bird sounds in the background. But that's enough of a preamble. We're going to head into the rest of Chapter 3 here. Before I move on completely from our discussion of the prefrontal cortex, I do want to very briefly mention psychosurgery, which is the use of surgical intervention to treat cognitive and emotional disorders. Basically doing brain surgery to try and fix or correct different kinds of behavioral or emotional disorders. So this is going to be related to a lot of things like lobotomies or corpus callostomies, where surgeons were severing different connections within the brain. So the textbook talks a lot about lobotomies, which severed connections between the brain's prefrontal cortex and other areas that it connects with. This surgery was favored because it ended up calming agitated patients, but those benefits came at a pretty high price because the patients often also became emotionally blunted and easily distractible and even childlike in their behavior. So even though it was touted for quite a while as a cure for most psychological disorders, it ended up causing more problems in the long run. And because of that sort of backstory, psychosurgery is actually it's not looked on favorably, we'll say. Most of these things are then sort of looked down upon and treated as sort of pseudoscience and kept very separate from something like, say, brain surgery to treat tumors or something like that. Even though things like, say, a corpus callostomy, which involves cutting our corpus callosum to limit the spread of epileptic activity between hemispheres, can be beneficial for those suffering from severe seizure activity. So psychosurgery is one of those things that's a little bit of a colored term, where we want to keep the history of it in mind when we're talking about different kinds of brain surgeries. Okay, that was sort of our little aside to wrap up talking about the prefrontal cortex. Before I move on, I actually wanted to introduce a new image. This hasn't been in our slides yet. It's not from our textbook. I actually borrowed it from one of my first year classes, but I'm a very visual person, so I'd much rather sort of see a layout or a map of the topics that we're talking about. So here we can actually see that we started our conversation on the central nervous system. And we focused in on the brain, we've now moved into the forebrain, and then we were talking about our cerebral cortex. So as we move on today, I'm going to pop back to this image just to show us which different pieces that we're looking at, just in case this helps you sort of orient what we're looking at and how they all nest together. So we've started with our forebrain, then we'll move on to our midbrain and our hindbrain, and we spend much less time on the mid and hindbrain. We sort of devote a lot of our time to forebrain because that's where a lot of the things that are related to behavior are driven from. And then towards the end, we'll get into the peripheral nervous system, just depending on how much time we have. But that's sort of our plan here for the rest of this chapter. So we covered our frontal lobe, so we covered this purple section here. We can now start looking at our parietal lobe, so this yellow section here. And specifically, we're going to look at the sort of matching pair that goes along with our motor cortex. So we talked about this precentral gyrus, which houses the motor cortex. And then we have our central sulculus, so a deep crevice in between, and that's the postcentral gyrus, so the next ridge behind that sulculus. And this is our somatosensory cortex. And sometimes you'll see it called a somatic and sensory cortex. Sometimes it's squished together. Sometimes it's just a sensory cortex. All are different terms for the same basic place. So this is the area here that we're looking at. It's going to process our skin senses, things like touch and warmth and cold and pain, all the things that come from our skin receptors. And it's also going to interpret the senses that inform us about our body position and movement. So our kinesthetic perception and things like that. This is also organized kind of like the motor cortex was, as a homunculus, where the size of each area depends on the sensity of the part of that body that it represents, which I'll show you in just a few slides. But I also had another image, again, that I've borrowed from a different class of mine, because I found that this image here is kind of like hard to see the difference between the different areas, whereas this image ends up having a nice clean label and very, very clear divisions of sort of our different lobes. So this is our frontal lobe, and this is our parietal lobe, and then the occipital and the temporal lobe, as well as our primary motor cortex and our here somatic sensory cortex, which somatosensory is the same thing. And then this also shows a nice clear label of Broca's area and Wernicke's area and all of those things that are going to be important. And just because this one's a little bit easier to look at, it's the exact same layout, it's the same setup, just a little bit easier to see. So I'm going to use this diagram instead. But I was in the midst of talking about the parallels between our motor cortex and our somatosensory cortex. And again, I found another image in one of my introductory classes that does a really great job of actually illustrating this. So we had already seen our motor cortex homunculus, where it's all sort of labeled out like this. But if we think of the motor cortex being the front slice and the somatosensory cortex being the back slice, if these were pressed up against each other, they line up pretty closely. And that kind of makes sense because one of them is going to be incoming sensory information and one is going to be outgoing motor information for similar areas. And the closer those areas are to each other, the less distance that signal has to travel. So if we can sort of input information from our hands and then directly transfer that across this tiny little gap here to the output for motor actions in our hands, that helps us know what's going on a lot more quickly than if it had to go to a bunch of different parts of the brain. So this is just another visualization that helps show how these two kind of mirror each other, and that's why they're next to each other on the brain here. Another couple of terms that we want to touch on before we move on are the association areas. So these are just areas that carry out further processing beyond what the primary area does. So if we talk about our primary motor cortex, there's usually going to be association areas where that information from the primary cortex is then further analyzed, further processed. So this is where we'll usually combine information from other senses. So maybe we're going to take in information from our sense of touch, but then also from our sense of temperature, so that you know that you're holding something that's hot. So these association areas are going to let us merge information from different parts of the brain, and they are usually going to be doing this outside of the primary area. Another special case that the textbook mentions is the concept of neglect. And this is a disorder in which the person ignores objects, people, and activity on the opposite side of the damage. So if they've damaged their left hemisphere, then they tend to ignore things on the right side of their body. And this is because our brains tend to process information from the opposite side of our body. And so when that damage has occurred, occasionally we don't register that it's damaged. We don't realize that it's missing. And so the body sort of carries on as though everything is fine and then just ignores that damaged portion, whatever's under its control. So this usually occurs when the posterior parietal cortex is damaged. So this would be, especially if it's on the right side, the right parietal lobe. So we've just been looking at the parietal lobe. I can actually hop ahead to this. So sort of this part, the parietal lobe, especially on the right-hand side, then we'll see sort of this neglect. And it's interesting, you can actually have people who, when they're shaving their faces, if they have damage to the right parietal lobe, then they wouldn't shave the left part of their face, or they wouldn't put makeup on the left side of their face. Or what other ones have I seen? If you ask them to draw a clock or draw a scene, they'll ignore half of that scene. They'll ignore everything off to the left, which is a very interesting and rare disorder that can happen. So that was just something that the textbook mentioned, so I figured I would mention it too. And I suppose I should reiterate that a lot of these topics for this chapter, this isn't meant to be a fully in-depth covering everything we need to know about all of these areas kind of a discussion. This is us establishing a roadmap so that as we start talking about these areas and as we go into the specifics of how they function and what they do and how they interact in later chapters, we at least know where we're coming from. So I'm aware that this chapter is fairly quick and not heavy on details, and that's intentional. So don't worry too much about all the other stuff. We'll get back into all of these different areas, especially stuff related to behavior because of the nature of this course. But that was our whirlwind tour of the parietal lobe. So that's this sort of green and purple part because the somatosensory cortex is part of the parietal lobe. But we're going to keep going with our sort of rapid fire tour and talk about the temporal lobe now. So the temporal lobes, the text for that is over here. These are regions containing the auditory projection area, visual and auditory association areas, and an additional language area, and important structures for learning and memory. So this part of the brain is very, very important. So we had talked about Broca's area and the fact that it's important for producing speech, or for forming speech, for putting together those motor movements associated with speech, hence its close proximity to that motor cortex. Wernicke's area is over here, and it's all about how we understand or interpret language. And it's going to bring in that language from nearby auditory and visual areas. So our occipital lobe at the back of our brain here, that's where our primary visual cortex is. So that's where all of our visual information is incoming. We also have our primary auditory cortex just sort of along here. This primary auditory cortex is actually mostly hidden inside this lateral fissure here. So it's kind of on the inside in the gap between our temporal lobe and the rest of the brain. But because we have the primary auditory cortex and the primary visual cortex so nearby, this area has our sort of association areas, those things that we just talked about, where they carry out extra processing outside of the primary area. So this allows us to integrate our audio information and our visual information and put them together. And because of its location sort of adjacent to those two areas, Wernicke's area allows us to interpret both audio and visual types of language information. This is also involved in helping us generate spoken language, because there's sort of a pathway that will go from Wernicke's area where we've taken what we have heard and we've formulated how we would like to respond, and then we send the signal to Broca's area to produce our response. So Wernicke's area is involved in production as well, but more in the planning stage rather than the actual motor action part. And just one more item here. So within the temporal lobes that I haven't pointed at yet, and this is the inferior temporal cortex. So this is in the inferior or lower part of this temporal lobe. And what it does, come back here, is that it plays a major role in how we identify objects that we see. So again, it's right next to our primary visual cortex, so it's sort of an association area where we can look at things and start recognizing what they are. So if people have damage to that part of the brain, they might see an item but not be able to tell you what it is. And there are some really interesting studies that looked at people who were shown common objects like a spoon or a pencil. And they know what they are, but they can't say what they are because they can't identify it. They can't make that connection. But if they're able to touch those objects, if they can feel them, then all of a sudden they're able to name them because it's using a different part of the brain. So that's one of the ways that we know that this is involved in visual identification of objects. And that gives us a really nice transition into the occipital lobe, which is responsible for vision. So that's where our visual cortex, or primary visual cortex, is. And so it's surrounded by all of the other processing or association areas that are related to vision. So the primary projection area for the visual cortex is located on the posterior tip of each lobe. And with all of those sort of nearby association areas, there are 4 distinct areas that help us detect individual components of a scene. So things like color, movement, and form can all be processed in those association areas. And so information from all 4 of those areas is then combined and sent to other association areas to continue processing. So there's a lot of different areas do sort of one thing or 2 things or bring information together and then send it off to a different area for more processing, which should start giving you this idea of how complex and interactive our whole brain is. So even though we talk about sort of the occipital lobe being related to vision, it isn't operating completely in isolation. There are other areas it connects to that are required. So just keep in mind the levels of complexity here. And to wrap up the forebrain, we're going to kind of lump together the last of our 4 big players here. So we can talk about the thalamus, hypothalamus, pineal gland, corpus callosum. These are all part of the forebrain. So we already mentioned the corpus callosum under our psychosurgery discussion, but we didn't talk about what it was. And the corpus callosum is a band of fibers that helps carry information between the 2 hemispheres of our brain. So if we are receiving information about the right side of our body on the left side of our brain, the right side of our brain might also need to use that information. So the corpus callosum is how that information that's on the left side can also be shared to the right side so that we can process it and do things and move things around. So as I mentioned, we have individuals who might have a corpus callostomy, which is where that bridge between hemispheres is severed. And that can be one of the only ways to help treat severe epileptic seizures. But it also serves to disconnect the 2 hemispheres of the brain. And we'll spend probably quite a lot of time talking about these split brain patients where their hemispheres can't communicate. And it allows us to see which information only goes to one hemisphere or the other. For example, split brain patients are why we know that information that we see or interact with on the right side of our body is processed primarily on the left and vice versa. For our other things that we can talk about, the thalamus, that receives information from all of our sensory systems except for olfaction. Our sense of smell is located fairly close to the brain, so it goes by a different route. Our hypothalamus plays a major role in controlling our emotion and motivated behaviors, things that we are intending to do or things that we are being sort of pushed to do. And then the pineal gland is interesting to note because we mentioned it when we were talking about sort of the animal spirits that might be involved in having our mind interact with our bodies. But in fact, its real role is to secrete melatonin in order to help us sleep. So it's just kind of neat to note that there. And as I said, we'll go into far more detail on these later on in the course, but this is the basics for this area. And that brings us back to this map here. So when we were talking about the thalamus and the hypothalamus and the corpus callosum, those are the remainder of our forebrain stuff. And then we're going to start talking about some of the other areas next. Oh, and I forgot that I included this, but another of those sort of images that I don't know if this one's from our text or if it's borrowed, but this allows us to see, like, here's our pineal gland, here's our thalamus, here's our hypothalamus, just in case it helps for you to see how they're all oriented. So that's just an extra visual there. And this image is definitely stolen from another class, but I found that it does such a great job of sort of distinguishing between all of these different structures on the interior of our brain. And it includes a handy dandy label about what their primary role is. So things like the hypothalamus, involved in regulating body function, the amygdala is really related to emotion, hippocampus will become important when we talk about memory. Thalamus is all about those sensory inputs, things that are coming into the brain from the rest of the body. And we can talk about the basal ganglia later on, that's related to movement and reward. So this is more just a useful reference image as opposed to something I want to spend a ton of time on. And the last topic that I want to touch on before we move out of the forebrain are the ventricles. So again, I'm going to swap between sort of an image to give you that visual part of it, and then the text on the next slide where we talk about it. But our ventricles are cavities in the brain that develop from the hollow interior of our nervous system. So basically, as our brain develops, there are these hollow areas that are left sort of open and not full of neurons. So there are 4 different ventricles, so we can see all of them here. So the first 3 hang out sort of above here, and this is why the ventricles are mentioned in the forebrain, because the first 3 ventricles are in that part of the brain that would count as forebrain. Our 4th ventricle actually protrudes down through our midbrain and hindbrain down towards the spinal column. So that one isn't gone into as much detail because it's not part of the forebrain, but it is there. Now, we won't, again, go into too much detail here, but these ventricles aren't just completely hollow. They're filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And that's a liquid that helps carry material from the blood vessels to the central nervous system. It helps transport waste away from our neurons and have them sort of dump it into the bloodstream to be recycled. So the cerebrospinal fluid helps stuff move around in our brain. And that's why those tunnels, those ventricles, are important to allow all of these resources to reach all the different parts of our brain. Now, the next couple of slides, I'm going to go into the midbrain and then into the hindbrain, but we're actually doing really, really well in terms of content and time. And since we've already had enough of a disruption, I suppose we can say, for the week, I'm going to actually leave it here, and then I'll do the last set of slides for Thursday's class. They're both going to end up being significantly shorter, and that's because I'm keeping us to, again, sort of the high level, not too much detail. So yeah, the lectures are going to be a little bit shorter, but I'm sure you can make use of that time to try and remember the associations between all these areas. You don't have to worry about, say, matching images to names. I'm not going to test you like that. I just include the images because that helps me. But you're definitely going to want to know things like which parts of the brain are associated with which functions. Because again, we're going to get more complex. We're going to build on all of that as we move forward. Of course, we have an exam coming up. So yeah, let's leave that there for today. Very, very short lecture, but that's fine.